Well, I've made it. It's Yellow Mountain in the distance there, part of the Roan Highlands. North Carolina-Tennessee state line runs along the top of it. Of course, we're on the Tennessee side. Appalachian Trail runs along the crest of it too. But this is the land where I spent a good part of my childhood. Down there's my great aunt's house. Barn my great grandfather built. He also built that house probably around 1946 or 47 when he got back from the Pacific Theater. There's the red barn. He built that, I believe it was back in the 60s or 70s. Owns my great aunt, she owns all this land here. My mother was raised right up there. That's a different house. The house she was raised in burnt down about 10 years ago. But that's where she was raised. And I spent a good part of my childhood here. I was just raised across that ridge right there. On the other side of that ridge, that's where my holler is. It's where my dad's side of the family, their land is. My old house is over there on that side of the ridge. You know, this is holy land to me. Holy land ain't some sort of Middle Eastern desert. And you know, each European people has their own type of holy land. People that settled Appalachia, Germans, Ulster Scots, Northern English, they chose this area, especially the Ulster Scots, because it reminded them of Scotland. Germans, Palatine Germans, Southern Germans. Probably reminded them of perhaps the foothills of the Alps. Temperate forest. That is our people's natural habitat after all. Although we are an adaptable people, of course. I love it up here. I only get to come up here a few times a year. Up here for Thanksgiving, I got a couple of days off from work. Climbed the old field here. My great-grandfather, when I was a child, had cattle up here on this field, up on this hillside, up to the ridge there. He also raised sheep. He grew tobacco there in the fields, garden, had some hogs. Used to have a pond down there, had some trout in it, ducks. One of the neighbors still leases a little bit of that patch of land right there out, raises cattle on it. I hope y'all can hear me up here. That the wind ain't too unbearable, you know. But today's Thanksgiving. It'll probably be a few days after Thanksgiving before I'm able to upload this video. But if you're here in America, I hope y'all had a happy Thanksgiving and that you were able to spend it with your family. Myself, I'm here right now. I'm among my tribe, you know, among my blood, kinfolk, my family. I just wanted to come up here and show you this place. It'd been a long time since I'd walked up this hillside here, up here to this ridge. Been a long time, many years. It's good to be back. But you know, I don't want to waste too much time up here. After all, as I said earlier, I'm among my tribe. I want to go spend time with them. But I'll have something more to add to this video later. I want to talk about something. The other night, my friends Pat, Yonder, and Dies Irae, we did a stream on Eric Rudolph and his exploits, his early life. We'll have the second part of the stream. We'll do it sometime. It'll probably be after Christmas. I ain't got a lot of time right now between work and traveling back and forth from here to southeast Tennessee for the holidays. But Dies Irae, he mentioned a very interesting thing, and that's what the meat and potatoes of this video is going to be about. And what he mentioned was that whenever a piece of land, an area, is converted from an area of what you would call production to an area of consumption, it has some very, very negative consequences. And the story that I'm going to tell you is about my own family. It's about my great-grandfather Scott, who built this place, and his son Roger, who was my grandfather, who lived just right up there. As I said, this is my mother's side of the family. And in one generation, this sort of thing happened. And I'm going to talk more about that. But I'm going to do that later, perhaps tomorrow. I just want to stay here and enjoy the view of the Holy Land. I'm going to walk back down here, hang out with my family, my niece, my brother, great aunt, father, all of them. I'll have something better to say, something more. The meat and potatoes, like I said. As you can see, I'm back down here in southeast Tennessee. And I have to admit, really didn't want to come home. I was having a good time. Only got to stay up there a couple of days, but I was among my tribe, you know, among my blood. I live about 3.5 hours away from them, 3.5, 4 hours. Didn't want to come down here. I mean, I hadn't seen my younger brother or my niece in about 11 months, and she's growing up so fast. She's 2.5 now. Look at her in this picture here. Look how cute she is. She's really smart too. She talked my head off. Me and her, my younger brother and my dad, we all went walking through the field before I hiked up on the hill. I miss home. I gotta go back. One of these days, I have to go back. Just a connection to the land too as well, you know. Although this, where we live now, is, I guess you could consider it extreme southern Appalachia. I live in the Tennessee River Valley now, but, you know, it definitely ain't the same, you know. Home is home. And I've got to go back one of these days. Have to. Anyways, didn't mean to get all sentimental there, I guess you could say. I have a couple of announcements before I finish this video out. This will be the last video that I post this year. I don't really have the time. Right now I'm working 60, 65 hours a week, and I know this time last year I took about a month off from lifting weights, but I'm not going to do that this year. I'm going to push through, you know. So I've just not got the time. I do have one, maybe 2 streams that I'm going to do before Christmas. I'm definitely going to do another Nord stream. Another solo stream of me rambling incoherently into the ether. But I actually got, you know, I've got a plan. There's a couple of things that I'm going to talk about in this stream. You know, I really like to ramble a lot. I have a real roundabout way of doing things. And I've been criticized for this before. But I like to ramble. And there's a reason There's a very good reason why I do things like this. But I guess I'll tell you that reason. I'll tell you why I do it like this in the Nord Stream, so you'll have to catch it whenever it is I decide to do it. One of the things that I like to do on this channel is I like to try to dissect and break down certain events and certain perhaps cultural things, different facets of the way we live. Me and my friends, we like to look at what I would call white psychology, I guess you could say. The psychology of our people on a collective level. And I've got to give my friend Pat a lot of credit, because I think that he has done a lot to sort of spearhead this. We try to examine the problems and what has led to these problems to manifest, you could say. What conditions have led to these problems manifesting? I have to give him credit, a lot of credit. And I like to break things down and try to see where our people, where we went wrong. And there's a lot of different opinions on this. But I think that it is a very worthwhile endeavor. And it's a very worthwhile pursuit. Because I'm of the opinion that until we get power over ourselves, and I mean this is also on a personal level, this can be applied on a personal level in your life. If you don't have power over yourself, if you aren't able to get yourself in order, how do you ever expect to be able to project power outwards? I think it's impossible. And I mean, I've seen this in my own life. You know, I've had to get my own life in order. I've had to clean house. I've had to fix myself, you could say, before I was ever able to do anything meaningful. And you know, we can blame all these other groups, you know, whoish tribe, these various ethnic groups that are invading our nations. And certainly, I am not trying to discount or alleviate any of the blame on them. But we have to look at ourselves, I think. What allowed us to get into this condition? Now, Dies Irae the other night, he brought up a brilliant point, and this realization didn't come to me until the next day. And Dies Irae pointed out that when an area, a particular area, becomes an area of consumption instead of production, it has some very deleterious effects. And in between the lines of drift, which is Eric Rudolph's manifesto, he talks about he grew up in Florida. His preteen years was spent in Homestead, Florida, near Miami. And he kind of gives us a background on how Homestead and the surrounding area there of southern Florida had changed. Before he had moved there, it was more agricultural. There was a lot of mango groves, avocado groves. And I guess about in the 50s and 60s, a lot of these groves, plantations, these farms, that were chopped down, and due to the growing population of southern Florida, a lot of these areas, they were clear-cut and subdivisions, just neighborhoods, cookie-cutter subdivisions, perhaps some governmental housing, things of that nature, was built on top of these old groves. And these areas right here became areas of consumption instead of production. You know, I'm not a fan of the suburbs. I made this video here a while back. You know, I think the suburbs, at least here in America, is one of the big reasons why our people are in the state that they are in. But you can trace this back, though, to this sort of civilizational model that we live under. This civilizational model, when people, you live in a large city, you live in a suburb, and I mean, I've noticed this just in my neighborhood back there that we live in now. There's not a lot of people. There's not a lot of people that plant gardens to actually try to produce food. Me and my neighbor across the street, I think we are the only two that I know of that have like some raised beds. I'm sure there's some others, but by and large, these areas are areas of consumption. And this sort of civilizational model has been happening for millennia, you could say. It really went into overdrive with the advent of the Industrial Revolution. And this is a very, very astute observation that Pat has made. He thinks that there was something that was triggered in Native Europeans' psychology, some sort of evolutionary event, you could say. It was triggered with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, and it's a negative thing. It's not a positive. Hold the camera here, I'm around this turn. This is a negative because, you know, people started, a lot of these people, the peasants, the peasantry, the farmers, they ended up giving up their land and moving into cities in order to get a job working at a factory. These people sacrificed their area of production, they traded it in for a life of consumption, you could say. They worked for these large companies, and this triggered a sort of psychological change. And we've witnessed, in my opinion, a continual degradation of our people's psychology over the last, say, 250 years. And it's affected different areas of our people's lands at different times. So here in rural Appalachia, this sort of thing started to happen after World War II. The generational divide between those who fought in World War II and the baby boomers. This is where parts of rural Appalachia started to become areas they started to transition from areas of production to areas of consumption. And I seen this realization came to me the day after that stream we did, that this happened just in the lifespan between my great-grandfather Scott and my grandfather Roger. These are my maternal grandparents, and this transition occurred during this time span. In between the lines of drift, Rudolph talks, there's a passage, and I read it during the stream, how he discusses that even in rural Appalachia, down there in southwestern North Carolina, where he moved to in his teenage years and lived, hid out from the feds, he talks about how the older generation had been very self-reliant. They produced their own things. They had these sort of insular communities. They could produce their own things. They were areas of production. They made moonshine. They used that as a currency. They farmed, grew their own tobacco. After World War II, the baby boomer generation came along. And with this came increased sort of industrialization, you could say. In Rudolph's words, the baby boomer generation was not as self-reliant as the older generations. They didn't garden or farm as prolifically. A lot of them still put out gardens, of course. This is rural Appalachia, after all. But a lot of these people, a lot of the men, even the women in the baby boom generation, they went off to work in factories for these large companies, large corporations. And he talks about how whenever they came home, they'd sit down in front of the TV, perhaps scarf down a TV dinner or something of that nature. They became more dependent on their career and their jobs instead of being self-reliant. They traded it in. It was a transition in their mode of living. Now, this sort of thing happened between my great-grandfather and my grandfather. And it produced problems. And these problems, of course, have compounded with each passing generation. My great-grandfather, Scott, he was the toughest man that I know. And he went off, as I mentioned earlier. Well, let me back up. He was born in 1915 up there in northeast Tennessee, northeast corner. Just a few miles down the road, down the holler from where I was at the beginning of this video. And he grew up rough, grew up poor. He was the third of 5 brothers, 5 children. And they had it tough, very tough. He went off, he was drafted, went off to World War II, Pacific Theater. He had a fairly violent time over there from what I understand. He was in the Philippines and a few other islands. In 1946, at the end of the war, he was in Japan for a period of time, came back to northeast Tennessee, came back to the holler. And the money that he had gotten from his service, he bought that land that I was on earlier. And he farmed, grew a lot of tobacco. Tobacco's a cash crop. He raised cattle, sheep, hogs, chickens. Produced a lot of his own food. Most of his own food. Own milk, butter. Very self-reliant. Of course, you know, he'd have to go to the village ever so often to get certain things, you know. Not completely self-reliant, but head and shoulders above what any of us, I would imagine, except for a few of us, are doing today. And he was a very tough man. Up until his 70s, up until his early 70s, he got up on that hillside that I was on earlier. He'd go up there with a mowing scythe as they call it up there in southern Appalachia. And he'd clear the hillside off, which of course, he had help from the cattle and the sheep. He built fencing. He was a very active man until he died of cancer, about a year before he died of cancer. When he was only he was 81 years old. He died when I was 9 years old. I was very close to him as a child. I made this video here talking about his life a couple of years ago. I look up to him. I look up to him a lot. And whenever my days are done, I've said before that I hope that my life follows a trajectory that is perhaps similar to his. Now, my grandfather Roger, he was born in 1947. My great aunt Lorette, who still lives at the place, who still owns the house there, she was born in 1948. And see, my great-grandfather Scott, he worked odd jobs. He worked as a carpenter, doing different things whenever he needed money. But he never worked at like a factory. Never worked, you know, for a large corporation. And he was very industrious. Extremely industrious. And my grandfather Roger, I made this video here also a couple years back where I took a realistic look at my grandparents. I love my grandparents. They're my blood. But they had problems. My grandfather Roger, he died back in 2004, 18 years ago, when I was a senior in high school. He was only 57 years old. He was an alcoholic. My grandmother, my mom's mother, she could be a very mean woman sometimes. Really mean. Her and my mother clashed a lot growing up. They fought a lot. And they had problems, you know. My grandfather Roger, he worked on the farm, helped on the farm, of course, while he was growing up. In his teenage years, he developed a taste for moonshine. And he ended up, when he came of age, my mom was born. My mom would have been born when my grandfather Roger was 21, back in 1969. My Aunt Kim was born the following year in 1970. And he worked at a furniture factory, furniture shop. He worked his way up, became a boss, one of the main managers of this place. It was called Empire Furniture up there in Johnson City, Tennessee. So see, there's a difference here. While his father worked odd jobs, just doing this or that, but mainly lived off of his farming, my grandfather worked for a company about 30 miles away. And he relied on this company. So see, what we have here is the beginning of the shift from production, an area of production, to an area of consumption. And it produced problems. And I'm not saying that this sort of change was the reason for my grandparents' problems. they made their own choices. They were hell raisers, to put it bluntly. My grandfather, he made a lot of moonshine. He grew marijuana while my mom was growing up, while he helped manage the furniture factory down there in Johnson City. As I said, my grandmother too, she could be a very, very mean woman. Just to give you on a little side note here, I was told that when my grandmother, she was the oldest of 12, and she was born in 1949. When she was a preteen, she was baptized in a creek at church. Baptized in a creek up there. And whenever the preacher lifted her up out of the water, a big water snake swam right past them. So I don't know if I know it's just a coincidence, but perhaps it was some sort of omen, you could say. And I'm not saying these things to denigrate and to put down my grandparents, because I love them. Even their faults and their failings. Because without their faults and failings, I have this sort of, I guess what you would call this Hegelian view of history, even on an individual level. My mother and my Aunt Kim, they had to deal with a lot of things when they were growing up that children shouldn't have to deal with. Like I said, my grandparents, they were hell raisers. I'm not putting them down, I'm just being honest. They weren't the best of parents. They provided, but they also they were very hard on my mom and Kim. My dad, he also had a fairly rough upbringing as well. But without my grandparents' faults and failings, my mother and my father wouldn't have turned out the way they would have. They had to grow up around a lot of partying and these sort of things. And my mother, she became pregnant with me when she was only 17. She had me just a couple of weeks after she turned 18. And her and my father, they knew early on, even when they started dating, that they didn't want their future children to deal with a lot of the things that they had to deal with while they were growing up. So I'm not saying these things to belittle and speak ill of my grandparents. I love them. But I'm just being honest. This is how they were. And of course, I don't mean to sound all negative. They were good people and they were successful because they reproduced. And without these faults and failings, my parents wouldn't have ended up the way they did. And I wouldn't have ended up the way I did. I guess you could say. It's just, I couldn't have gotten here without everything that happened beforehand. Both the good and the bad. Now, when you transition an area and a people from a people who produce to a people who just consume, produces a lot of problems, like I said. And I think this is just one of the many reasons why our people are in this condition today. So my question to you is, what do you produce? What do you produce? What can you produce on your own with little to no reliance on anyone else? And I'll be honest, I'll answer it for myself. There's really not a lot that I can produce. Unfortunately, that is the product of this civilizational model. We are dependent on so many things. I can grow food. That is one thing that I am fairly good at. I can grow food. I've done it every spring since I was a child. Planted a garden. Helped my father in his gardens. Helped my great aunt in her gardens. I do have a decent amount of knowledge about growing food. These raised beds I have back here. Very successful year. I grew a ton of sweet potatoes in a small area. Got a lot of tomatoes, bell peppers, okra, peas, squash, all these things. I can catch some fish. I can do a little hunting, although I'm not nowhere near as good of a hunter as I am a fisherman, I believe. That's a skill I need to work on. I haven't been hunting in many years, not since we moved down here, to be honest. But we want to be able to try to produce things for ourselves, because self-reliance goes against the grain of everything that this Western liberal democracy tries to push down our throats. To be self-reliant it's the cold revolution, as I call it. It is a genuine form of rebellion to produce things on your own. And I'm going to work on producing more things this upcoming year. I'm going to build myself a moonshine still. Not because I like to drink. I'm not a teetotaler, or teetotaler, however you say it. But I don't drink often. Very seldom. But I think it's a skill worth having. And it's in my blood. It's something that I need to learn. The other thing I'm going to try to produce, we are going to try to produce, is a child. Because, I mean, really, I think a lot of people talk about these different forms of activism in these circles. The best form of activism you can ever do, I believe, is to procreate, to bring another native European life into this world, and to raise it well. That's the greatest form of activism, and any of you watching this that's got children already, as I've said before, you're doing the work of providence. You're doing what needs to be done. Anyways, that's my challenge to you. What can you produce, and what can you learn to produce? Anyways, this video's been long enough. I've rambled long enough. I'll do that stream, the Nord Stream, here next couple of weeks or so. And I may have another stream with a woodlander, but I'll have to talk to him. We've already agreed to it. It's just a matter of when I can do it. We're going to talk about the winter, and we're also going to talk about some English history, so I'm going to have to do some research beforehand, and I may not be able to get to it before Christmas. I may have to wait till afterwards with my job and everything. But anyways, try to think of things that you can produce, skills that you can learn. Because like I said, this is the cold revolution. I can't speak much about the hot revolution, at least not on this platform. It's probably not smart to speak too loudly about it online either, to be honest. But cold revolution is what we can do to help ourselves to survive. And once we work on surviving, you've got to focus on thriving. Anyways, thank y'all for watching. I'll see y'all next year. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.